Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Sharby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on the recent content. We do have a comment to read, as usual, on our short, pertaining pretty much about, Team USA and their excursion in France. And we talked about, this Team USA roster being the greatest of all time, and a lot of you guys disagreed. And Jimmy Crackhead 12, great username, definitely disagreed. He said, nah, too many close games. The Dream Team destroyed every team by 30 to 50 every game. I think that's a good point, but look at who they were playing against and look at who Team USA was playing against, this year in the Olympics. And, there's a crap ton of, competition around the world at this point. The world has gotten so much better at basketball. And I just think, the versatility of the 2024 Olympics men's roster is just too elite. I think, it from top to bottom, I think it clears the Dream Team.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we talked about, where we were saying, a lot of guys on this roster can kind of do whatever you need if you want to get the best out of them, right? Like you have guys on the roster who can shoot the three at a high level, right? Guys that can shoot from the mid-range, guys that can get to the basket, guys that can switch on defense, guys that can play man-to-man defense, guys that can block shots, guys that can rebound, guys that can pass, dribble, shoot, everything. So I think that's where it kind of comes from. And it's not that, like you said, that the previous iterations weren't good.
Right.
It's just that this one, the combinations, right, of the different skill sets is what makes them so dangerous, right? Because again, like when you go back 30 years ago, right, like say the three-point shooting wasn't necessarily the same. Now they had a lot of size, right? And they had a lot of good athletes. So obviously that can make a difference right there, because of the fact that you have, some ginormous human beings on that roster. Like even at, the guard and the forward spots, right? Like say like you had Michael Jordan 6'6" as a 2 guard, or Scottie Pippen as a 6'8" small forward, right? Like Karl Malone, who's like 6'9", 260 or whatever, right, at the four. Or Charles Barkley is undersized, right? For a four, but he was a big dude that took up a lot of space, and he was a really good athlete, right? So
Sure.
I can understand all of that. I just think the combination of the players and the skill sets and everything, I think, is what makes it a more talented team.
Yeah, my question would be like, who's guarding Katie? Who's guarding Steph? I just don't know if any of those guys from that era could really, be able to put up a fight. And then, I guess there isn't really like a debate of like, if they go head to head, who wins. I think it's more so like of a debate, like, which team would go further and like which one is really more dominant on paper and in practice and in theory and stuff like that.
Because that, yeah.
No, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, because that's the tough part of kind of comparing, that's why it's always so tough when people come up with all-time lists, right? When you're looking at individual players, because how can you, compare, a guy that played 60 years ago to a guy to today? And that's, kind of, I think when you look at the game in terms of it's always moving forward, right? Like say, and it's not that the game was garbage 30, 40 years ago, right? It was just different. But now, there is more talent. There are guys that have more versatile skill sets, right? There were not too many 7-footers, right, who could score from kind of anywhere on the floor, right, 30 years ago, right? And that's not even just Kevin Durant on this roster, right? Like you have a Joel Embiid, and others on the roster that have a lot of size and skill as well. So, I think, again, that's where I think it puts it over the top. And again, that's no disrespect to the previous eras or the previous players, because they are also great in their own rights. I just, like you said, I think on paper, I think this is the more talented team.
Yeah, 100%. Regardless, Olympics were great. I think, the Paris, they did a great job hosting, and obviously the presentation was awesome. Before we, do kind of get moving on, we do have our offseason breakdowns of every NBA team. So kind of look out for, your favorite one. We're continuing in the East, but, before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so, unfortunately, we're going to have to move on from Gorshon Yabusele and move on to the Washington Wizards. So, the Washington Wizards last season were not very good, right? They went 15-67, right? They were one of the worst teams in the NBA. I believe they were one game away from having the worst record, right?
Yep.
I think Detroit had the worst record, and they were second worst, which, who cares? Like, it's still really bad.
Yeah,
but,
it's bad.
But again, a little bit different from Detroit. the Wizards went into the season basically going into year one of a rebuild, right? Because obviously they had, a handful of seasons at different points, right? The last several years where they were kind of trying to be good, but either may have not been good enough, may have had some bad luck in terms of injuries, right? Like with John Wall towards the end of his time in DC, or just other random stuff. And finally the Wizards did the right thing and, basically said, we're moving on. Now, it was a little bit too late, I think a year later than it probably should have been, but at least you did it, right? We know what happened. They moved Bradley Beal to Phoenix for Chris Paul, or excuse me, yeah, and then they got Jordan Poole over from Golden State,
Yep.
right? So we know how that happened. Obviously, they also dealt Kristaps Porzingis to Boston, and then they got back Tyus Jones from Memphis, and they had themselves a season. Not a good one, but they had themselves a season. But, now they move into, I guess, year two, right, of the offseason. And now you're going into the first full year, right, where, you know what you're going to have with this roster, right? Because, obviously we didn't know initially that Beal, and Porzingis were going to be moved. Like, you thought they might, but you just never know, right? You never knew what you were going to get. And the previous history of the previous front office kind of suggested that they would have ran it back, but this is a new front office, as we've talked about many times, right? Also replaced the coach, right? Out Wes Unseld Jr. in, right? What is it? Brian Keefe?
Yeah, Brian Keefe
Yeah,
in. Yep.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, we'll see how long he sticks around, during this rebuild process. But where their offseason starts really is more so with the draft, right? Obviously they made some free agent signings as well, but the key acquisitions really are from the draft, right? You drafted three guys: Alex Sarr, Bub Carrington, Kaishawn George, right? So, you look at the guys that they drafted, and with Alex Sarr, right, that was the highest draft pick, number 2 overall. And he's the guy that we talked about when we did our mock drafts and when we, you know, did our live draft reactions and also post draft talk with our podcast, right? Where he's a guy that has, a lot of potential mainly as a defensive guy, but offensively, he's very raw. His floor is very low right now, right? Like, his offensive game is just not there. And that's kind of where there are some concerns, right? Because we've seen, 7-footers come into the league, have basically little to no offensive game, and they just kind of stink, right? Like if that's the case, then you have to hope that they're an elite defender, right? There were signs in the summer league that showed that he could be, a high level defender, but at the same time, he still hasn't learned a lot of it yet, right? Like that's something that is still going to have to kind of progress as he gets, more comfortable with, how to defend at the NBA level. The offense is kind of the bigger question mark because, he takes some jump shots, but we don't know if he can necessarily shoot, right? Like, there are other things where he likes to play with the ball in his hands, but we don't know if he can actually create shots off the dribble yet at a high level. Obviously, he's 19, so that kind of stuff, can grow over time, but it's a question mark, right? But obviously, it sounds like he wanted to go here, right? He didn't want to go to Atlanta, right? Because they already had some competition in that front court with him, which, again, is not something I would normally think you would hear, but, it happened and they
Mhm.
drafted him. So this is probably the best spot for him to go, for him to try to play and earn minutes and, whatever. Because I'm sure he'll probably start right away, right? I mean, they don't really care. They'll probably have some random weird lineups where you got, 4 forwards or something
Yeah.
like that. You just never know.
Yeah.
But um, then you look at their other draft picks, right? Bub Carrington and Kaishawn George. Bub Carrington, right? He's more of like a scoring guard, right? Like he's got some playmaking capabilities, right? We talked about him. We both like him a lot, where he's very adept at being able to score off the dribble, right? Pull ups, mid range, catch and shoot threes, right? Obviously, maybe needs a little bit of work on that. But again, he's very young as well, right? Another 19-year-old. So obviously he's got plenty of time to grow. That was the pick, obviously. We'll talk about their other transactions as well, right? They got that pick from moving Denny Avdia, right, to the Portland Trailblazers. Um, and then Kaishawn George is, probably the other guy that I feel like the guy that probably people know the least about, right? Because, he was the lowest pick, right? He's another guard, but not like a point guard, right? More like an off guard, right? So, I mean, we'll see what he kind of does, but, I don't know. But that's kind of the extent of their draft picks, right? And
Yeah.
then, you kind of move on to the other
What's so
transactions.
funny, man? I know it's the Wizards, but man, come
Yeah,
on, man.
no. Then you move on to their other transactions, right? So, their, biggest signing of the offseason, right? I guess if you could call it that, was stealing Jonas Valanciunas, right, in the dead of winter, right? 3 years, $30 million. It was a signing that, I think there was a report from Jake Fisher not long before it happened,
Hmm.
right? That was kind of suggesting that it would happen, but it was like it's not something you would have predicted at all. Just from the perspective of why did they sign this guy? But obviously, the defense for it was that okay, he can play the five. Alex Sarr can kind of play early on at the four, so that way you can kind of put another big physical guy next to him, that can rebound and do whatever. That's fine. And I guess he can kind of play inside, so that way Alex Sarr doesn't always have to force his way inside, right? So I mean, okay, but obviously also they're gonna probably trade him. But which is fine, right? If you can actually get something out of it and not have a situation like Tyus Jones where you lose him for nothing. Obviously, he's on a 3-year deal, so you're not really in danger of losing him for nothing because he's on a multi-year contract. But your intention you would think would be at some point to move him. They also brought back Rashawn Holmes, right? Nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's just another guy that was on the team, veteran guy, might be a movable contract, right? Because it's a 2-year deal, right? So again, we'll see what happens. You could always kind of, it's so next offseason it could be an expiring contract. Maybe it could be a piece where a team's like, we need to find a backup center. Not a lot of great backup center options out there. Maybe we have, we can get this guy. We have like, $12 million of expiring money, whatever. So, you got that. Then they also traded for Malcolm Brogdon, right? He was in that Portland trade, right? Where it was, where the Wizards sent over Denny Avdia and the Wizards got back, the pick that turned into Bub Carrington, and they also got Malcolm Brogdon. Another piece where he's actually also an expiring contract, right? Similar to the Tyus Jones thing last year, right? So you would hope that Brogdon has enough stock right around the league that he could probably, hopefully, get moved, by the deadline, right? Because he's a veteran guy, doesn't really need to be on this roster, doesn't really have a place on this roster. Not that there's anything wrong with having veteran guys on your roster. It's just you'd like to also get some of your other guards minutes, right? Because they drafted basically 2 guards in the draft, and they have other guys that can kind of switch between the 2 and the 3, like a Bilal Coulibaly, who you want to, also give minutes to, right? Because that was their big lottery pick guy last year. So, you want to make sure that those guys can get as many minutes as possible. And, it's going to be hard with some of the vets that are on the team, right? Because you do have some vets that are good players, right? Like Brogdon and Valanciunas are good players that aren't just veterans that are going to be okay with just sitting and never playing, unless they're hurt or something like that, knock on wood.
Hmm.
Still got you still got the 2 stars, Jordan Poole and Kyle Kuzma, right? 2 former champions. So obviously you have that, to look forward to. So, I mean, again, they had a relatively active offseason, right? So you did a lot of stuff in the draft. You made some trades. You made some free agency transactions. So, I think they did a solid job to put themselves in a position of they're going to be bad. They're going through the rebuild. And then you just kind of hope that at the deadline, can you kind of squeeze a few more assets out of some teams, even if it's like just a second round pick or something, right? Like, if you don't get anything out of Malcolm Brogdon, that would be kind of a disappointment. Because then you can say, if you move Denny out, right? Because the Denny Avdia trade stuff, that story isn't finished yet necessarily, right? Because you could still move that piece that you got back for Denny Avdia. Then you can say, all right, we didn't just get Bob Carrington, we also got the future other picks that they got, and then whatever you get back for Brogdon, probably another bad contract and maybe a future pick. I don't know if it's going to be a first because it seems like the way that teams are kind of operating with a lot of these deals, it seems like they don't want to give up a first for these type of guys, but they might, right? Because he's a good player. So it's really not so much about what the lineups and rotations are for the Wizards, right? Because obviously, it could look it's a roster that could look pretty different by the deadline. I mean, again, maybe you could say a projected type of starting 5 could be, probably like Brogdon, Poole, Bilal, Kuzma, and then, Sarr. But then, like, if Valanciunas is there and he's going to possibly start, right, then one of those guys is going to be out of the lineup, right? And it's not going to be Koulibaly, I wouldn't think, because you just drafted him in the lottery. So it might be Brogdon because he at least has some experience playing in a 6-man role. So he could easily come off the bench. And then, like you said, because you said during the latter part of last season, right, Poole had some good numbers, right, kind of as the quote unquote point guard with the ball in his hands, right? So it could probably be that Bilal, Kuzma, Sarr, and Valanciunas. That could be something. Who knows? But either way, they did have a busy offseason, right? For a team that's really bad, they did a lot of things, right? I think they did some things that you like in terms of what they did in the draft. The free agency signing, right? The Valanciunas one is a little bit weird, but at least you can defend it from the perspective of it's another big guy. We know that teams want centers. We can probably get something for him at the deadline, so that's fine. Even though, again, it's very bizarre. And then obviously you might be able to move some of the other vets at the deadline. So to me, I'd say a B, probably fine for what they did in the offseason. I mean, of course, like, some people may give them a higher grade because I know there were a lot of people that actually liked a lot of what the Wizards did, this offseason because of, all the young guys that they drafted. Again, even though it's not supposed to be a great draft, again, you're a bad team. So, and any one of those guys could possibly turn out to be a really good player, right? Is it likely that all three hit? Maybe not, but can two of them hit? Right? And then let's say if two of them hit, can Sar be close to an all-star? Can he be an all-star? Right? Could Bub Carrington be like a decent starting point guard or starting guard? Could he be a decent backup guard off the bench? I don't know. So, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. Obviously, you're the Wizards fan, so obviously you'll probably have a more insightful perspective in that regard. But like I said, I think I'm cool with what the Wizards did in the offseason. And I think, you can also look at it in two parts because you can also say that at the deadline, they'll probably do some additional stuff, and then it'll probably make the offseason look even better, right? Because in order to get the stuff that you get at the deadline, you had to do what you did in the offseason. So I think they did fine. Again, I mean, if you look at their over-under, you can guess, right? It's not very good. It's 21.5, right? So, I mean, that means that they think that they'll be better, I guess, compared to last season, but still bad, which I think makes sense. But, again, they'll still be one of the worst teams in the NBA. So, but I feel like I'd be a little bit concerned if they had a worse record than last year, like by a decent amount, right? Because then you're starting to talk about like getting close to like 12 wins and stuff like that.
Single digit numbers.
Yeah, like which again, I don't think that's gonna happen. But I mean, can they win 5 more games than they did last season? I mean, maybe. I mean, there are some other teams in the East that got worse, so that might make it easier for them to get a few more wins. But I mean, much more than like 20 or 22, I feel like is kind of pushing it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I agree.
And I think if they had way more than that, I think they would start, punching fire extinguisher glasses or something like that.
Yeah.
Like they want to be bad.
Yeah, they need to be bad. The whole thing is, I was talking in a live stream earlier about, what the win count was probably going to look like for the Wizards. I estimated under 20, basically 20 or less, which I think is pretty much on par with the rest of the NBA world. The expectation, the expectation is not for this team to be good, like you already talked about. Did you have anything else to add? Because I feel like I'm going to be on this soapbox for a while.
Yeah, I mean, like just from the perspective of, I think I'm fine with what they did in the offseason, right? Like there are things maybe that you can nitpick that you may not have liked, like, just letting Tyus Jones walk for nothing, right, and not getting anything out of him at the deadline, right? That kind of stings. I don't know what a team would have given up to get him, but if they were kind of like declining a bunch of deals because they thought, because they were like, we don't like what we're getting, then that's just kind of dumb. Because I just don't think you would have gotten a ton for him anyways. But it's better to get not that much than basically nothing, in my opinion. So, if that may be the part that you might dislike the most. But I think overall their offseason, was solid, right? Like I think compared to previous off seasons where it just, where it's like they're almost kind of trying to trick you into thinking that they're going to be really good, but then they're not good. So then you're disappointed. I think this one is fine from the perspective of you expect them to be bad and they didn't disappoint in that regard. And they also set themselves up so that way they can not just be bad, but awful. So that way they can get, a high draft pick, which is kind of what you want at this point, right? Like if you're the Wizards, you're not aiming for a playoff spot or a play-in spot. You're aiming to be dead last in the Eastern Conference. And, that is very realistic, very feasible.
Yeah, I think it's doable, and that should be their number one goal. I'm going to just start out and flat out say my grade. it's a C. I think, C for confusion. That's kind of like the way that I look at it, because, objectively speaking, I think, you could look at it and be like C, but from a Wizards fan perspective, I could go higher if you want me to be honest, just because I am in love with the draft picks, but that's Wizards bias. So, like I said, objectively speaking, I think it's confusing because a lot of people, are scratching their head about this whole Denny Avdia situation. Like you said, we don't know all the details. We don't even know if he requested a trade or not. Who knows? But I feel like that's a big loss from the Wizards. Right. Me personally, like I wasn't too high on him to the point where it's like I thought he was untouchable.
Right. But he was good.
Yeah, he progressively got better. In my opinion, a little bit overrated. But different kind of player. A lot of people within the Wizards fandom, were crying for him to kind of, run the point guard and run the offense. I didn't think that was very smart. No. So I'm glad they didn't do that. But, to see him go kind of stings, especially for, what we did get back in return. I think right now it looks underwhelming. But like you said, in the future, it could look really good. You have a bunch of pieces here that are going to be moved on from. I think this is the most fluid roster in the NBA. Like, I think at this point, it's going to look very different when it comes down to the deadline. I think post deadline, probably four guys potentially gone. Because I think, you'd look at Valanciunas. I think he's one of the targets. Brogdon, Kuzma, and maybe even Poole. Because I think what you need to do here, if you're the Wizards, you need to, number one, you obviously should be focused on development. Developing the young guys. You want to see Bilal take a step, especially offensively. You want to see what Sarr can do with the ball in his hands, because we already know he's going to be okay on defense. Bob Carrington, decision-making. Keyshawn George, and he's actually really listed as a forward, which is interesting. He's about 6'8". Does he progress with the ball in his hands as well? What does he look like shot creating and stuff like that? Because I think the only issue with him would probably be his efficiency from the 3-point line and decision making, but his defense is there. And then also another point, I think they need to work on rehabilitating Jordan Poole and his value, because it's going to be tough to move on from that contract. Does he play that contract out? Does he get traded somewhere else because his value goes up? So I expect him to kind of start, be the point guard. Left. Yeah, be the one. He's got to be the one.
Yeah, 3 years left, $30 million this year, $31 million next year, and then $34 million in 26-27.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think he looked good playing the point guard, and I think he should have been the point guard the entire season. I never understood him playing off the ball. That just wasn't smart. And Brian Keefe is the one who kind of transitioned him into that role, and he's also going to be the head coach.
Right, and Jordan Poole as the starting backcourt when we did the offseason thing for the Wizards last year.
Right, and that makes total sense. So I think, we're going to see Jordan Poole start at the one, which is good, because he can provide a little bit of mentorship to Bub. And, the guard room is interesting for the Wizards because you have a bunch of dead weight at the bottom, I feel like. Johnny Davis, don't know what he's going to do. Probably nothing. You have Kispert, who's a bona fide scorer. He can shoot the ball, but what else can he do? That's another guy who could potentially be on the move as well. So there's things that you like about the roster, and there's definitely things that you don't like. I think signing Sadiq Bey is kind of underrated. It fits the timeline in terms of what it's going to look like 3 years down the line, maybe, 2 years down the line. Because right now they're not looking to contend. In 3 years, they should be coming out of that rebuild. I want them to be kind of on the Orlando Magic track, And the problem is, like, you look around the league, the Wizards are in that small percentage where they don't have a guy or the guy. There's no superstar on this team. Star, really, if you want me to be honest. Like, I feel like it's the Wizards, Brooklyn, Utah that are probably like the three teams that don't really have a star. Maybe Portland too.
Maybe Portland too, because I don't think we know enough about any of their young guys.
Right. So like they're this is bottom of the barrel. Like it's really hard to talk about this team and what they're gonna look like down the line because there's so many unknowns. We don't know if they do get the number one pick. They could pull a Detroit, have the worst record in the league, and get the fifth pick. Then who do you draft? Because although the next draft is going to be deep, you probably don't want to fall to 5. That would be very disappointing. Right. I really don't know what to say, if you want me to be honest, because I feel like I like the moves individually, but collectively, it's confusing. Because, like you said, Valanciunas on this Wizards team doesn't really fit. You know,
Yeah, that's
ideally,
someone
what
that
they're, yeah, it's weird.
yeah.
Like, you love what they did, bringing in three guys. You know, you went all in. You're moving on from pretty much everybody who was in that Beal era, and you're committing to the young guys in their development. And then you start signing interesting players like Sadiq Bey and
Right.
Valanciunas. Like,
Or at least with Bay, he won't play this year because he's
sure,
got the
because he's
ACL.
injured.
Like that's the funny part is I didn't even mention him
Yeah, but
just because.
that's why I was saying I liked it, because he'll
Right.
fit the timeline. Because by the time he's coming back, he's still young. He's not going to be like old as dirt or anything like that. He's
Right.
got potential.
25.
Exactly. So he'll be like what, 27 by the time he comes back. So that's why I kind of like the moves here and there, like
Mhm.
extending Rashawn Holmes. I get what they're trying to do. That could also be a guy they move on from.
Yeah.
Brogdon, that's another guy you move on from. I don't understand the Anthony Gill one. That will never make sense to me. And
Probably a
that's,
locker room guy.
yeah, but even then, like, I feel like we have some other ones. But you look at the additions. Like, you brought in Valanciunas, brought in Brogdon, brought in Sadiq Bey, Sarr, Bub Carrington, Keyshawn George. I think that's a pretty good, addition list. But then you look at the losses. The one that stings the most isn't even Avdia. I think it's really Tyus Jones, because you got absolutely nothing for him when you could have gotten, I think it was rumored, 2 first-round picks, at minimum 1.
Mhm.
And you let him go to Phoenix, and he signs there for a minimum. So I think the future is there. It's just we don't have the vision yet. The direction isn't completely clear. There isn't an identity yet, but clearly their priority should be development. That's what I'm kind of looking at. I want them to
Yeah.
prioritize development. I don't care. Shouldn't be looking at wins. Like I said, it should go development, rehab Jordan Poole's value, and then start flipping people.
Right. So to you, what would a good Washington Wizards season be like? What would a successful season be? Because obviously that's different depending on what team you're talking
Sure,
about, right? Because for say the Boston Celtics, right, championship,
sure.
right? But for the Washington Wizards, right, who's on the opposite end, what's the ideal successful season roadmap for this team?
Okay, so let's look at the bottom of the East, right? Last year it was Brooklyn, Toronto, Charlotte, Washington, Detroit. Washington won 15 games. I'm expecting Detroit to be better
Right.
than 14 games. I'm expecting Charlotte, if healthy, to be better than 21 games. I'm expecting Toronto probably around the same as last year with 25. Brooklyn will fall. I think Brooklyn and Washington are probably in contention for the worst spot in the East.
Yeah.
But I think they need to win around 15 games. I would say a little bit higher. I would say
Mhm.
probably like 17 or 18. That would be a good spot for us, because it's a little bit of, it's 3 extra wins than last year.
Right.
But that also means we were, in theory, better than last year, but also still not great or not
Right.
good at all. And we
Yeah.
need to get the number 1 pick. It's either got to be number 1 or number 2 pick, because I think, if you can either get Ace Bailey or Cooper Flag, it's a done deal. Like, there's your guy. And the Wizards haven't had a guy since what, John Wall, Bradley Beal era. So
Right.
that's what an ideal situation would look like. And also not just being bad, but being bad and being smart about being bad. Like, move on from guys. Don't hold on to them. Flip these guys for more assets. That's what we should be doing. I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Wizards have the most second round picks in the league right now. So
Right.
keep stockpiling this stuff. And it's the OKC model. We already know where Will Dawkins is coming from. So I think that's what an ideal situation would look like for me. And like I said, it's all about development. And one more thing, Brian Keefe, he's a developmental coach. He was very pivotal in the OKC days with Russ, Katie as well. So he was kind of the guy who, watched over their development. So kind of just be on the lookout for guys to kind of not develop at a crazy rate, but maybe a little bit more accelerated than people think.
Right. Yeah, and like you said, that's a good point. Like from the perspective of, be bad but like you said, be smart about being bad, and also just from the perspective of like say with Detroit, like a bad season for them is if they get 14, 15 wins, that's a bad season for them. That's not a
Sure.
successful season for them because they've already in theory grabbed the guy, and they've also already in theory accumulated a lot of young talent over the last several seasons because they've
Yeah.
been bad for so long. But for the Wizards, this is now year two, right? But like almost not even really year two. You could almost just categorize it as year one, right? Just from the perspective of like, last year was a transitional year into being bad, and
Yeah.
you were also bad, right?
Yeah.
But now this is the first full year of going in, knowing we are absolutely going to stink. Not that they didn't know that last year, but you know what I mean.
There
Like
was still a little glimmer of hope. People, not necessarily like had high expectations. Well, I did, but the general populace didn't have like high expectations for the Wizards and really the duo of Jordan Poole and Kyle Kuzma. But you kind of thought that the other pieces around them would kind of elevate alongside them, but everybody kind of just stunk.
right. So and that's yeah. So like you said, development and not having a like some type of process, I think would just those two things I think are kind of what you're looking for, right? Like you
Sure.
said, more so than wins, because we went to some Wizards games last year, and those games, not a lot of sense was being made,
Mm-mm.
when we were watching. I mean, some of that was also just personnel, but then some of that was also just I don't know what what they're doing when they're out here. Like you had like Gallinari playing center,
Yeah.
and to be fair, like they didn't have a lot of centers on the roster at that point. And that's not even the only thing. I'm just talking about like even on both ends of the floor, right? Like it'd be a possession where a guy just has the ball for like 20 seconds and doesn't do anything,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's just you'd like to see a little bit more growth in the process, and hopefully that's what Brian Keefe can do. But again, over under 21 and a half, probably under.
Oh
Definitely
yeah,
under,
yeah,
I
yeah,
would
yeah.
say.
Guaranteed under. Once
Yeah,
again, we
it's a
don't.
lot.
This is not betting advice, but
Right.
it's pretty much a lock.
Yeah.
Like
I
you
would be
bet that.
I would be very shocked if they won more than 20 games.
If they won more than 20 games, that's an unsuccessful season, in my opinion. If you want me to be real.
Unless it's like a scenario where like everybody wins more than 20 games.
Sure.
So then,
Or if like Sar carries us to victory. Okay, if that's the case, if Sar like is like a monster and like averages like, I don't know,
right.
15, 12 and like 4 blocks or something. Okay, cool. And we won 20 games. Now I'm feeling a little different because then maybe
Right.
Sar's the guy,
Yeah, because that's a good point. Like, let's say you're bad, but your young players look good.
Right.
So that's
Right.
kind of what you would like to see. So, what would a successful season be for them? What would you like to see from?
Ooh, that's a good
those
question.
guys in year one.
That's actually a really good question because I feel like the focus of the Wizards, like I said, should be the young guys. I think it should be that those 3 guys that you drafted. Maybe not so much George. I feel like he's like the dark horse to be like low-key elite because he has the defensive tools. He has the length, obviously. It's just the offense is really, really, really raw. It's just as raw as Sar, just on a smaller scale. But for Sar, it's got to be double-double for me. I don't know how realistic that is considering he's not the kind of big that kind of bangs down low and gets rebounds like that. So maybe like 10, 7 and 2 blocks. Is that realistic, do you think? Because I think that would be good for him. But as the number 2 pick, that's a little underwhelming.
Right.
Although
that's the tough part.
this is a bad draft in a lot of people's eyes, but for him, I would go with that. And you can add your thoughts in, and then we can move on to Bub or something.
No, I agree. I think because I don't think you're expecting him to put up Wemby numbers, right? He
No.
may be the next Wemby, but probably not this upcoming season. So, I think, like you said, somewhere around 8 to 12 points, 6 to 8 rebounds. Somewhere between like 1.5 to 2 blocks. I think is probably like a solid season. But like you said, for the number 2 pick. You don't feel great about it, but I think again, like if he can do that and not shoot like 40%, or 30-something% from the field, like I think that's probably fine. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't have to be 60-70% from the field like he's DeAndre Jordan or Wilt or somebody like that. But, like depending on how many jumpers he takes, like somewhere around 45 to, a little over 50 from the field, I think would be nice.
I also want them to cut that out. I don't want them to focus on. I don't want it to be the Alex Sarr show and he's just chucking threes. That's what I don't want the season to look like. Like I said, we got to be smart about being bad. We can look okay and still be bad, but that would be looking bad and being bad. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I guess moving on to Bub, that's a tricky one because it all depends on what his role is going to be. That guy might not even really crack the rotation, but like I said, if they prioritize the development, he should be getting a crap ton of minutes. But how do you facilitate minutes between what
He's got so many
Brogdon?
guards.
You got Brogdon, you got JP, you got even like Corey Kispert. Because where does Bub play? Does he play the 1? Does he play the 2? Where is he going to play? But let's say he does crack the rotation and gets a decent amount of minutes. I'd say between 7 and 10, maybe 3 assists
Right.
on efficient shooting. That's what I would say. Because I'm not expecting a lot defensively from him.
Right. And like you said, if he doesn't play a ton of minutes, like you're not going to put up crazy numbers anyway.
Right.
So like you said, can he just flash? Can he show that his skill set is replicable at the NBA level? Like can he, like you said, can he score at a decent clip off the dribble? Can he be okay as a catch and shoot guy? And can he play make a little bit? Because if he can be like an okay combo guard as a rookie, right? Not great because your expectation isn't rookie of the year level, but if he can be like an okay combo guard off the bench, I think that's a relatively solid expectation, for him. Like, because again, like his offensive skill set is kind of the main reason why you draft him. So if that replicates at the NBA level, then you're feeling all right. And then it's at that point, it's like, can he not be a complete train wreck on the defensive end, and can he improve a little bit as a 3-point shooter?
Yeah, agreed. And then George, that's a tough one because he might not play. He legitimately might not play.
He
But
might be
if
a G League guy.
if he does play though, I would say like 5 points, showing not necessarily like stat stuffing defensive stuff, but can you get stops? That's what I would be looking at. Can you get stops and can you shoot?
Yeah, can you knock down an open jumper? Can you make hustle plays?
Basically, be better than Johnny Davis.
Yeah, well, that bar is subterranean. That's
my point.
Yeah, I mean that one is that's a low bar to clear. But it's funny because he was drafted a lot lower than him, right? Because Davis was what
Lottery.
10th?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, George is a mid late first round pick,
24th, I think.
Yeah, late first round pick. So
yeah, very late.
It'll be interesting to see. And then I guess Bilal year 2.
Oh,
you
yeah.
already kind of mentioned it, right? Just like offensive growth.
Yeah.
Mainly, and then obviously, a little bit more versatility. Like, could you kind of start experimenting with having him guard, like 1 through 4 or something like that? Like, because that's the type of stuff that it's all right to experiment with,
Yeah.
right? Like, you don't have to experiment. Could we play him as a small ball 5? Like, no, you don't
Right.
have to do that. But, can you experiment with kind of stretching and testing the limits of what he can do defensively while also hoping that he can get some offensive growth?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I feel like what we saw from him in the Olympics was a little underwhelming. Didn't play too much.
Right.
But
Yeah,
when I did see him, I thought he looked okay. Not leaps and bounds better, but obviously it's a completely different game, completely different system. But I think he can take some of that experience and bring it to Washington because I think that's kind of what we need, and maybe we get a little bit of a French connection between him and Sarr. That would be kind of cool. Maybe they gel together a little bit, chemistry wise. I'm trying to think of what else I like about Bilal. Jump shot, that's something to watch and maintain because I feel like the problem with Bilal, and he's so young, is the decision making is a little spotty. There's times where he has a wide open shot, he'll pump fake to then shoot when you could have just, shot. And I get it. It's a confidence thing. It happens. It comes with time. It was his first season last year. So I'm expecting big things from him. Not like, all-star level, but a better season than last year. And I thought he did have a good season, but I don't think I have too many concerns about him defensively. Like I said, it's offense. Because if he can learn how to create, that might, I'm not saying a star, but that's a solid piece.
Yeah, the offensive growth is probably what's going to kind of determine his ceiling because if he can, like you said, if he can not just hit open shots but also create like even a little bit or even facilitate a little bit, then that's kind of what's going to allow him, like you said, to go from a solid player to not a superstar, but
Mm-mm.
like a really, really good player,
Yeah,
right? Like the
exactly.
type of guy that's like a really good piece on a good team. And that's probably, that would be, one of the things that you would hope, when you look at his age, right, and his versatility, that he can kind of grow into a lot of those roles. And like over time, also like if you can find some decent playmaking guard, that will help make a lot of those guys better as well, right? Like I don't necessarily feel like they have that yet, right?
Bub could be
But
the guy.
yeah, it could be him, but you just never know. But right now we don't know.
Because
Like right,
that's my only problem is
right,
the four young guys. They're all gambles. Like that's the
right.
one thing I don't like. I
Yeah,
love it, but I hate it. You know?
and there's not a piece that kind of brings them all together yet.
Nope.
But and like you said, that's where if you can get, that top 3 draft pick, that's where that guy, even if he's not a point guard, can kind of just bring them all together. Because then it's like I'm the guy on this team, and then everybody else just kind of has to fulfill a role,
Yes.
around me, right?
Yes.
But
Thank
and
you.
like you said, that's a tough spot to be in, right? Because some of these other bad teams do have that, but not the Wizards yet. But that's also because they haven't, been a bottom feeder for long enough yet, right?
Bingo.
Like they've not been great, but they haven't been like, bottom 2 worst team in the NBA, for a little bit yet. So they need a little bit more time for that. So that's what we're looking for
Yeah.
from that Wizards team.
Yeah. It
So
should be an
now,
interesting season.
yeah, exactly. So now, moving on, right? The NBA schedule was released today. Obviously we're not going to talk a ton about it, right? Mainly just because I think some of that, might be, should probably be saved for, like when we actually talk about some of the individual teams, because some of the teams that will actually be trying to win games, their schedules will kind of matter, right? Just because of the fact that, some teams have easier schedules than others, right? Some of it is kind of intriguing, right? Because like say the team with the hardest strength of schedule going into the seasons is supposed to be Portland, right? But if, it doesn't matter because we know Portland is going to be a stinky team next year, right? Same with Utah, who has the second toughest schedule. But then like you look down and it's like, well, Boston actually has the easiest, strength of schedule, right? And then New York, then Milwaukee, right? Those are the teams with the 3 easiest schedules. Now, to be
Hmm.
fair, you're in the East, so you're not going to have a one of the hardest schedules in the NBA if you're in the Eastern Conference. But, just kind of looking around, it's interesting. The Wizards actually, since we're talking about the Wizards, they have the 18th toughest schedule, right? So they have a slightly below average, schedule in terms of how hard it is, which doesn't really matter for them, right? Because they're not going to be good. But it is kind of just something. I mean, when you look at the strength of schedule, like, does it really matter to you more so from the perspective of, is that actually important for, say a team that's trying to win games to have like an ideal schedule?
I think it does, but
Oh,
the caveat is when does that strength of schedule really kick in? Because there's times where at the end of the season, like, a team that's fighting for, potential playoff spot, they're not going to get in because their strength of schedule is like the toughest remaining, So I think it
right.
all depends on when it really does kick in. But for a team like Boston, yeah, that plays right into their hands and that advantage, that's just kind of another added advantage that they will have, going into the season because, not that they can afford to, take their foot off the gas, but, you got to keep in mind no Porzingis for a little bit. So, they
Right.
got to put the
Probably
pedal
have.
to the metal. Exactly. So they got to put the pedal to the metal. So, and that goes for a
Yeah.
lot of teams, but it really, I think it comes down to certain stretches because I think it fluctuates. There's times where the
Right.
ranks shift a little bit
Yep.
because of the strength of schedule remaining or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. And then sometimes you have teams that have injuries, right? So
Right.
then what normally would have been a tough stretch, maybe an easier stretch, or vice versa, and things like that.
It plays into it though, for sure. I think, in terms of
Yeah.
a
I mean,
team's level of success.
yeah. I mean, for me, I think so too. I do think if you're a good team, I feel like it kind of evens out and kind of works its way out in the end. Like, say, if you're Boston, right? Like, you should still be able to win like somewhere around 60 games, like regardless of if you have the easiest or the toughest schedule.
Hmm.
But like you said, where it is very, very important, especially is for those teams that are kind of in that, like you said, middle ish tier, right? Like you said, with the teams that are, kind of trying to avoid the play in, right? Maybe like somewhere between like that 5 to 10 spot, right?
Hmm.
Because especially in the Western Conference, right? We
Yeah, I was
know
going to
that
say.
in the Western Conference, there's basically, more, over 10 teams that are trying to be in those final 8 playoff spots. And, the last couple of years, right, all these records come down to 1 or 2 games. So, like you said, a really bad stretch, maybe you have a rough 5 to 7 game stretch, and then you go 2-3 or 2-5 in that stretch, and that could be the difference, in your season, right? Between being, you know, fifth or being eighth or something like that, right? Like say a team like the Los Angeles Lakers, right, where after the in-season tournament, right, they were, before coming off the in-season tournament, right, they were a top 5 seed. And then, that month-long stretch where they were just awful, right? They dropped all the way down from 5 to 10, and then they basically stayed in that 9-10 spot, for the rest of the season until right at the end when they got to 8th. And so for a lot of those type of teams, you can't have those type of stretches. But for the top teams, it probably doesn't matter too much.
Yeah, like that race between the Lakers, Golden State, even like Houston kind of being on Golden State's tail, like that
Right.
whole stretch was very influenced by strength of schedule. So
Yeah.
I think it matters for sure.
Right. And then also, like, sometimes by the end of the season or close to the end of the season, you'll have some teams that were trying to be competitive and then they realize, oh, wait a second, we're actually not really good. And then, then those matchups aren't as tough, right? Because then, there's not as much effort being put in, or sometimes the roster's completely different, right? Like the Wizards roster, which is already bad, could be even worse, right? By the time the season,
It
is
will be.
over, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If it's not, then you failed. But,
Yeah, then they didn't. Then it's not a successful season.
right. So exactly. So, just but again, we'll go into some of these other schedules in a little bit more detail. Obviously, we're not going to cover all 82 games. We're more so mainly going to talk about, the strength of schedule and how that could impact some of these teams, records or standings. So, just, stand by for that. But obviously, if you're following the NBA, right, the schedule was released. If you're watching this on Friday, it came out Thursday around 3 p.m.,
Hmm.
for all those teams. So, we had games that had gotten leaked over, that stretch, right? A lot of key matchups, and we talked about some of them. But since the last time we recorded, right, the schedule went out. Now it is. And now for Bleacher Report. Whoops. Yeah, don't. Yeah, cut that out because I don't say Bleacher Report. Um, and now for news rumors. Again, we're in the dog days of the NBA offseason pretty much now. So, we're kind of at the bottom of the barrel for some of this stuff, but obviously we're still going to talk about some of it. So, Jazz, they've signed Australian legend Patty Mills, basically 1 year minimum contract. Didn't really expect it, honestly. He's a veteran guy. They've been signing a number of players, obviously, since the Markkanen, contract extension renegotiation thing. Now they're kind of using, because they had to use some of that cap space, and now they can do what they needed to do to sign some guys that they kind of already agreed to before. Patty Mills is a newer signing. Don't really expect much out of him at this point, given his age. He played for the Miami Heat last season, funny enough, right? And he probably wouldn't have played as much if it wasn't for injuries. Played well for the Australian national team, right? He averaged 16 and a half a game, and shot 40% from three, as he, has been known to do, right? He's had a good career. So again, like I said, not expecting a whole lot at this point. But, again, it's a veteran guy, locker room guy. And again, like he could be a valuable asset to some of those young guards that they drafted, and brought in Utah.
Yeah, I mean, entering what year 16. So,
Yeah.
like you
So,
said, not a whole lot of expectations, but he will provide that veteran presence, and we know what he can do. We know that he's a knockdown shooter. We know that he turns into Steph Curry light in the Olympics and FIBA. So, congrats to him, because I think he deserves a contract in terms of veteran leadership and things of that nature.
right. Because like we talked about
And
with some of
Utah
these
needs
teams,
that.
yeah, exactly. And like we said with a lot of these, bad rebuilding teams, there's nothing wrong with having some veteran guys on your roster. Like you do need that because we saw with the Houston Rockets a couple seasons ago, right? They had that stretch where not only were they bad, like you said, they not only were they bad, they looked bad. They looked incompetent. They looked, awful. No
Hmm.
process, no nothing basically, right? It
Hmm.
didn't look good, not one bit. And, with Utah, obviously, again, you don't have like the most talented team in the world, right? But a guy like Patty Mills, right, that can be in your ear, right, kind of just telling you about things that he's seen at the NBA. Obviously, like you said, he's in year 16, So obviously, if he's been able to stick around this long in the NBA, that means he was doing something right. So,
Right.
that's a guy that you should listen to, if he's on your team. So these are the type of signings that, again, like, aren't going to add necessarily to your to your record necessarily, on the court, but off the court it makes a big impact, I think.
Yeah, 100%.
According to the Athletic, Anthony Slater, uh, it says that the Golden State Warriors and general manager Mike Dunleavy Jr. feel the general urgency to win with star Stephen Curry, but aren't getting the pressure directly from the player. Quote, the key Warriors stakeholders grasp Curry's sustained greatness, and team sources said there's an internal understanding that his current supporting cast can't be considered a finished product if the 2025 NBA championship is believed to be a reachable goal. Now, I don't think it's a reachable goal, but that might just be me. But
Oh, I agree.
but
It's not just
regardless,
you, buddy.
yeah, Curry was in on the recruitment of Paul George. Dunleavy keeps him in the loop on the options and ultimate personnel decisions. Curry hasn't expressed any signs of panic or unrest. Well, I mean, I feel like if it was panic or unrest, that would be kind of a nuclear scenario. I feel like. I mean, but again, of course, we'll see what happens with Golden State this year. But again, it's just kind of a rough spot to be in because you have a guy who's clearly still very good, clearly still a top 10 player, right? Even though he's not as high on that top 10 list as he was before, but the team is just not good enough, right, to be able to realistically compete for the title this year, right? And last season's roster, I know there were a lot of people that were high on it, but neither you nor I were high on it. Like, we considered them a contender, but we didn't really see an actual realistic scenario where they could get out of the West and win the title. We didn't think they had enough size. And we didn't really I was not really in love with I honestly wasn't super in love with some of the additions from last season, right? Like, I mean, I still didn't really I know Chris Paul wasn't bad, but I just thought it was kind of just pointless, and now he's not on the roster. But either way, what do we even, and I obviously we'll have a longer conversation once we get into the Warriors offseason vid, at a certain point, but what what do we expect from this roster? Because it's like I still don't really know the starting five. Um, I don't know how many games they're going to win. I don't, the ceiling for the roster probably isn't much more than last year's, right? But I don't know. Like, it feels weird, right, going into a season, right, where you have stuff on your roster and, like, you don't have a chance. But that's kind of what it is at this point.
I mean, that because they don't have anybody like that's on that team that helps propel them to contention. Like, you're gonna have to hope for two things. You're gonna have to hope for Wiggins to actually look like an NBA player again,
Right.
and you're gonna have to hope that there's a disgruntled star out there somewhere
Hmm.
that will kind of rear his head when deadline rumors start to happen. So you can potentially make a
Yeah.
move to get that person. But the problem is with deadline moves, sometimes those don't come into effect until the next season
Right.
because
Like,
it's hard to integrate a star
right.
into the system, and you go very, very far in the playoffs.
That doesn't normally win you a title.
Nope.
It can get you, to the finals, right? Which we've seen many times before, but that's about it. We just haven't seen, we just haven't seen, any real
Mm-mm.
empirical evidence, right, of a team makes a giant, change in their roster, right, and it nets them a title. Usually, the teams that win a title are good right away. Maybe they make some small moves or medium whatever moves at the deadline, but you can tell, like, within the first couple months of the season, like, yeah, this is one of the best teams.
Yeah, I've completely sold my stock on the Warriors, not Steph, of course, but that team is not going to win the NBA Finals. And that's why I feel like that 2022 championship hits so much harder,
Right.
now looking back on it.
It wasn't expected at all.
No, no. And I think that speaks to, everybody who was in and a part of that Warriors dynasty, their greatness and things like that. But I feel like it's over. Clay
Yeah.
is gone. Draymond is probably not what he used to be. Like you said, Curry, still a great player, but can't do it by himself. And that's the key here. He cannot do it by himself. And right now he's by himself. And that's the unfortunate reality.
Right. Yeah, and according to him, Anthony Slater of The Athletic as well, right? He said the Jazz and Warriors never reached the stage of deeper negotiation involving Markkanen. Also, the Utah Jazz were reportedly not as willing to trade Lauri Markkanen to the Warriors as initially perceived, and that's kind of what we talked about, where where he basically kind of said in quote, Markkanen's true availability was a mirage, right? Where it's just it just seemed like
What did I
like
say last time, bro?
yeah, and that's kind of what yeah, exactly. And that's kind of what we talked about a while ago where, there was just a lot of conflicting stuff with the Jazz, and we talked about it where, at a certain point, why do you feel like you have to trade Lauri Markkanen? Because we talked about like you're still going to be bad with or without him on the roster. And if you're going to be bad with him on the roster and you can get a top pick, well, that's kind of the most ideal scenario because then you have your building block in this year's draft, and then Marketing can probably slide closer to being like, a second guy. Obviously, as a rookie, Marketing it will still be his team, right? And he's certainly getting paid like it's his team. But ideally, he's not your number one guy, but he can be a very good piece on a team. And he's gotten better every year, right? He's been great for the Jazz. Again, it's a lot of money. He's going to be basically paid 50 million a year, from here on out. Aside from I think this upcoming season where he's still making 42. Um, so we'll see how it goes. But either way, we talked about it. Like after it got to a point where you just started hearing back and forths, like if you didn't already think by then that he wasn't going to get moved, like there's no way you thought that he was going to get moved by that point because it was just the signs were there where it was just it's not going to happen. Especially considering like it sounded like from even the Warriors end that they weren't really giving their best offers either, right? Like it was Moses Moody and picks, and that's not going to get you our market, and it
Yeah,
shouldn't.
that might have been the most unserious trade rumor stretch that we had in a long time, in my opinion. Like from the jump, I was like, I don't buy it. Like you can just kind of smell the BS when it's in the air. So
Right. And then finally, according to Shams, Joe Harris retires. 2019 three-point contest winner, played 10 seasons for the Nets, Cavaliers, and Pistons. Right. So, obviously, yeah, the guy was a really good shooter. Unfortunately, right, he tended to be a guy where regular season shot the ball very well, but when it was time to really contribute in the postseason, yeah, he tended to disappear, right? For his career, 10 points a game, fine, over 10 seasons. 48 from the field, 44% career three-point shooter, and then playoff percentages, 8 points a game, 39 from the field, 35 from three. And that's the tough part where, if you make your name as a three-point shooter, well, three-point shooting has a high level of variance from year to year, and in the playoffs, it's a lot harder to make those type of shots. And if you can't make them, what else can you really do? So, that was rough. But obviously, this isn't a time to be negative about this guy, right? Obviously, being able to play 10 seasons in the NBA and also, get paid at different points is an accomplishment, right? So hats off to him, for a solid career. And good luck to him and, his next chapter.
yeah, I can remember times where he was a key part of that Brooklyn Nets roster. Come in and
Right.
just spot up and hit threes. When attention was needed elsewhere. So like you said, awesome career. I believe he played on the men's national team for 2019 in FIBA. So that's another accomplishment to his career. So shout out to Joe Harris, man. Great 3-point shooter. And yeah, I think he had an accomplished career in terms, for what he was and what his role was on various teams.
Yeah. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know, sound off in the comments your thoughts on Team USA, sound off in the comments about the Wizards offseason, and sound off, in the comments about, things like the NBA schedule, Joe Harris, and all of that. So, again, obviously the live streams have stopped. They may come back at a certain point. Obviously, we haven't figured that out yet. But we'd like to probably do some of those before the season starts up again. But obviously, we'll have to figure that out. Obviously, shout out to everybody for helping us, blow past our goal of 100 subs, right? We're currently trying to get to 500. So hopefully everybody can help us out, do us a solid and, get us there. So again, don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell to get those notifications, and we'll see you in the next video.